Folks, welcome again to our next segment. Hello. And we are very proud to be hosting these open town hall meetings. Today, our topic of conversation will be constitutional reform. And today we also have a very special guest that we would like to introduce to our viewing audience, and that's Professor. In fact, I want to make sure that I give him full credential. He's a learned professor that is actually practicing accounting, I think, at university, at York College, and that's Charles Sugrim. Charles, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. From our studio here in Richmond Hill, Queens, New York, a very warm welcome and good afternoon on a very cold winter day here to all our viewers, our live audience, and to our guests. Today we continue a series of town hall meetings to discuss issues affecting the lives of our people, both inside and outside of our great countries of Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Caribbean. I am Charles Sugrim, an accountant by profession, having completed the Bachelor and Master's program in accounting and the Certified Public Accountant, the CPA, here in New York. I'm one of two partners in our accounting and taxation firm of Bumdat Sugrim and Associate. I'm also an adjunct professor at CUNY York College in Jamaica and Queensborough Community College in Bayside. Today, I'm honored to be the moderator of this town hall meeting, which is sponsored by Globespan 24/7. Today, we will be discussing constitutional reform in Guyana. As we are all aware, Guyana has a constitution at our independence given to us by the British. The so-called Independence Constitution guided the nation until October 6, 1980, when our current constitution became our guiding principle. Our constitution preceded a constitutional referendum held on July 10, 1978. The bill for a constitutional referendum held on July 10, 1978, the bill for that was passed in Parliament on April 10, 1978. The referendum was reportedly approved by 97% of the voters, with a turnout of 70% of the electorate. The then opposition and international bodies claimed that the turnout was only between 10 and 14%. So what is a constitution, and do we need one? According to the Oxford Dictionary, a constitution is a body of fundamental principles or established precedents according to which a state or other organization is acknowledged to be governed. The composition of something. In Guyana's context, the constitution is the supreme law of the land. It outlines the branches of and powers of government, establishes qualifications and times of elections, lists basic human rights principles, and sets up institutions to protect those rights. It also limits the power of the government and establishes a system of checks and balances. It places the government's power in the hands of its citizens. Guyana Constitution, like that of Trinidad and Tobago, contains 12 chapters. Guyana Constitution is further subdivided into 232 articles. A constitution helps serve as a set of rules and principles that all persons in a country can agree upon as the basis of the way in which they want the country to be governed. A constitution should spell out the ideals the citizens believe that their country should uphold. This brings us to today's discussion. Do we have a constitution that our citizens believe is ideal to our makeup? Since the enactment of our 1980 Constitution, there were numerous amendments and repeals of articles in the Constitution. So the question is, does our Constitution need to be reformed? To help us answer those questions and more, I'm assisted today by three distinguished and honorable gentlemen from the Caribbean. From Trinidad and Tobago, we are honored to have the Honorable Basdeo Panday, former Prime Minister of that great island of Trinidad and Tobago. He has distinguished himself as a legendary leader who has worked tirelessly to transform Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. From Georgetown, Guyana, we are honored to have the Honorable Ralph Ramkarran, senior partner of the law firm of Cameron and Shepherd and former Speaker of Guyana's Parliament, and now one of the leaders of the recently launched and new and united Guyana political party. Last, by no means least, Mr. Ruel Johnson, a member of the Alliance for Change and advisor to the Minister of Culture, and a prolific writer among his many achievements. So now we will look at a presentation on the constitutional reform, and we now hand it over to Devin. Devin, can we have that?
For example, it says that the party that wins the majority in Parliament shall form the government. That is, the party, the executive shall control the Parliament. So you have your executive here and you have Parliament here. And what you have is a situation where the executive is in control of the Parliament. If the executive is in control of the Parliament, there is no way the Parliament is going to keep the government under control. You have to separate them.
Correct.
And the way to separate them is you have to change the Constitution to allow for proportional representation, so that you can have there represented the widest cross-section of the people based on, not on race, but on economic interests. The farmers will put up their candidates. The youths will put up their candidates. The small businessmen will put up theirs. The medium-sized businessmen. Everybody will put up their candidates, and you'll have a parliament representative of the widest cross-section of the people. But you will have an executive which is outside of the parliament. That is to say, there's got to be an election for a parliament, and we don't need a Senate. We took that from the British because they had a House of Lords, so that you have a parliament which is representative of the people, so that you have another election. Another election to elect the head of government. We don't need a head of government and a head of state. Why do we need that? So you have a separate election, and that election takes place on the basis of first past the post of the entire country. That person, he or she, who is selected as the head of state, head of government, will choose from in his own judgment, her own judgment, from the population whom he believes to be capable of running the government. That is the only way people who are qualified can get into running the government, not under the present system. So that is, you'll have an executive. He will appoint the ministers, but they will be subject to review of a parliament. And that is what the parliament does all the time, reviewing what the government is doing. If they want to appoint a chief justice, executive goes ahead and appoint it, but he must come before the parliament for scrutiny. And if the parliament approves of it, fine. And it is that kind of control over the executive that the parliament must have. That is the only way things are going to change.
Now that is the situation, that is the problem that we need to solve. That's the problem. And the current constitution makes it impossible for two political parties to come together before the election, except they have one slate. I force ordered from him a separate election for the president with a 50% plus one majority. Force our political parties to seek alliances among either smaller parties, but if encouraged, between the two major parties. And I think that will reduce the kind of political problems we had, which arose over the 2011 elections, and they help to encourage coalitions and alliances. I don't believe the day will come.
History of both producing, I would say, world-class writers, originally from Guyana, but a suppression of really free literary content at home. What that's resulted in is the fact that much of Guyanese history has been left unexamined by literature. And so the best thing for now, and our reforms in government have been increasingly fluctuating, but now at a point in which there could be, I think, quantifiably more democratic than, say, in the past 10 years. What's the result of that is that there's a new generation of writers who now have an opportunity not just to examine contemporary Guyanese reality, but also look at and turn their imagination to these vast swathes of history that have been unexamined, not just by literature, but also by history, historiography itself. So that is the most, I think, exciting and the best thing about writing from Guyana now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Devin. I have one correction, and my apologies to Mr. Ruel Johnson. I was informed that he's not a member of the Alliance for Change, so my apologies to you, sir. The first question I want to ask is to Mr. Panday of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Panday, the average person that are out there may not know the importance of constitutional reform. Can you take a few minutes to explain to our audience in Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and the wider Caribbean what a constitution is meant to achieve?
Well, first of all, I want to get, sorry. First of all, I want to get away from the dictionary definition of a constitution. A constitution must have purpose, and the purpose must be to create a nation that conduces to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. That is what a constitution must be. And having set the objective of the constitution, you then frame a constitution to achieve that objective. In both cases in Guyana and Trinidad, the constitution is the antithesis to this dream, because what it failed to realize is it was imposing a British-type constitution on a nation that was divided ethnically, racially, tribally, whatever you want to call it, so that the constitution is such that it produces two parties, each which is racial or ethnic based, competing against one another in a parliament and totally ignorant of developing a dream for the nation. And that has got to stop. And unless we change our constitution, in which we separate the government from the parliament, that is to say, the executive from the legislature, we will always have that kind of problem. Because the legislature, the government controls the legislature. So they determine what they spend, how much they spend, what they do with it. And you can't question that the Constitution does not permit a real mechanism for questioning the government, because the government controls the parliament. There's got to be a separation of powers. The old Montesquieu theory, That is to say, you must have a parliament elected on the basis of proportional representation. And I tell you, if that happens, people will not vote on the basis of race, but they will vote on the basis of economic interest. And you will have several groups represented in the parliament in representing economic, not racial and ethnic interests, but their economic interests. The farmers will have representation there if it is elected on the basis of proportional representation. The small businessmen, the medium-sized businessmen, the intellectual, whoever wants to be in the parliament. But the parliament will be representative of the widest cross-section of the people. Right now, it is representative of two major races or two major blocks. And that is not democracy. And then there must be separate elections at which we elect a head of state who is also a head of government. Why do you need a head of state and a head of government in a place like Trinidad? You don't. You have a separate election in which the head of state, head of government, will be elected on the basis of first past the post. That person will then select a cabinet from persons who, in his own opinion, are the best persons suited to run the country. That is the only way people who can run the country will be running the country. Right now, what you have representative of two racial groups, and that new executive, separate executive, must come to the parliament for monies on a program that it has for the next 5 years. In that case, the parliament is controlling the executive and not the executive controlling the parliament as it is today. Let me not take up all the time. That is unfair. So that let me give the other guys a chance. But that basically is where I stand.
Thank you, Mr. Panday. Now to Mr. Ramkarran. Mr. Ramkarran, as a former senior member of the PPP and the Speaker of the National Assembly,
I think you have a train somewhere above you. Is that a train? There's a terrible noise.
Okay, so let's go on to...
Hello.
Oh.
Hello.
Yeah, Mr. Ramkarran?
Yeah.
Okay, you're on live now on the program here in New York. My question to you, Mr. Panday, just give us an outline of the need, what a constitution is meant to achieve. My question to you is, as a former senior member of the PPP and the Speaker of the National Assembly, did you have the authority to initiate constitutional reform? Why the urgency now, and do we need constitutional reform?
Well, the answer to the first question is, as Speaker of the National Assembly, I have no power, nor does the current Speaker have any power to initiate constitutional reform. As regards the second question, constitutional reform, basically, nothing is substantially wrong with the current constitution as it stands. But constitutional reform now is a euphemism for restructuring our governance system to ensure that that the major political parties have a stake, an executive stake in the running of the country, because instability is creeping in. It leads to corruption. It leads to lack of development, and all of these things. That's a short answer to your question.
But do we need constitutional reform now?
I think we need constitutional reform now because Guyana is plagued by an ethno-political distress, that the people of Guyana are divided into two parts. the African Guyanese part and the Indian Guyanese part. And both of them have their own political parties which strive for political dominance. And in such a system, it creates what I just referred to as instability. And that is what we have been arguing that we need to resolve. Because unless this is resolved, Guyana will remain two different countries with two different peoples who believe that each one is trying to get at the other, and each one is trying to dominate the other. And that is why we need constitutional reform to end this system.
Thank you, Mr. Ramkarran. Mr. Johnson, you're part of the current government and they campaign heavily on the need for constitutional reform, but they seem unable or unwilling to move the needle on constitutional reform. Do you expect the electorate to believe the government with any promise made in the next campaign? Mr. Johnson?
Are you hearing me clearly?
Mr. Johnson, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, are you hearing me?
I'm hearing you. Yeah. No. Is my connection clear?
If we get a problem, Mr. Johnson, can we go on to Mr. Panday, please? Mr. Panday, the ethnic makeup of Trinidad and Guyana are similar in a lot of ways. However, Trinidad, at least from the outside, seemed to enjoy significant development as compared to Guyana. How did your constitution create a pathway for a better Trinidad? And can Guyana incorporate any of your articles to make ours better?
First of all, Trinidad and Tobago has advanced economically because they had petroleum and they had oil. And that is the reason. So that they, even in spite of all the corruption, waste, and mismanagement, there was still some to go around to improve the economy. But had there been a different kind of system, Trinidad and Tobago would have been a place where people would be happy. Because although you see Trinidad is supposed to be economically developed, 1.3 million people do not have an access to pipe-borne drinking water. Would you believe that? There's a housing problem in Trinidad. There is a problem of poverty in Trinidad. All of that, although we had such tremendous wealth, because of the Constitution did not give the people control over the government. And so the government was able to squander as much as they possibly can, waste, corruption, and mismanagement galore. And that is why we are here. And it applies not only to Trinidad, to Guyana. Guyana is also a place with tremendous natural resources, may not have oil, but tremendous natural resources, which cannot be used because the political system has pitted two racial groups fighting one another for power, for political predominance. And unless we change that, neither country will succeed in the goal of making its people happy. That is the function of government, to so create a society, to so organize the economic and social society that it conduces to the happiness of people. Do we have that in Trinidad and Tobago or Guyana? We don't.
Thank you, Mr. Panday. Is Mr. Johnson back on? Can we hear Mr. Johnson?
Hello?
Mr. Johnson?
Hello? Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Johnson, sorry about that. My question to you was, the current government campaigned heavily on the need for constitutional reform, but they were unable or unwilling to move the needle on constitutional reform. Do you expect the electorate to believe the government with any promise made in the next campaign?
Well,
What I would say is this: the constitutional reform is a mechanism that exists in the hands of both parties, both the opposition and the current administration. Both have given the lip service to constitutional reform. In fact, the 190 Article 119A of the Constitution speaks to a standing committee for constitutional reform. Early in the administration, the current administration, there was the establishment of a special committee to chart the way forward on the constitutional reform process. That has not proceeded beyond the initial report, which has timelines, a budget, a specific mechanism. I think it was an 18-month timeline that they provided for. Now, before we get to the mechanics and the particulars of constitutional reform, I want to touch on issues that PM Panday and to some degree Mr. Ramkarran touched upon, which has to do with the fundamental problem we have, which is the ethno-political conflict, which is a cultural issue. And before we can get to even as we get to the mechanics of constitutional reform, which deals with power sharing from a governance perspective, those issues have to be addressed either before or along with constitutional reform. How it is that we begin this sort of a national conversation, and this applies to both Trinidad and Guyana, for healing that divide. So as we progress, I want to put forward some ideas with regard to how it can be done. Speak to the issue of power sharing, which possibility exists currently within the present constitution, but largely at the discretion of the executive president, and a discretion that has not been exercised. So those are areas I want to touch on as we go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Johnston. Mr. Ramkarran, as a leading member of the new and United Guyana, what guarantees does the Guyanese public have that you will not be like your former party and shelve any proposed reform to our constitution if you're elected to government?
There's a lot of background noise. I didn't hear your question.
The question is, as a member of the new party was formed, what guarantee does the Guyanese public have that you will not be like your former party and shelve any proposed reform to our constitution if you're elected to government?
Well, we don't have any guarantees except our word. We have done two things. We have said that if we don't win an absolute majority or a plurality, which would entitle us to take control of the government, then we will not join in any single political party to form the government, as the AFC has done. If we do win the government, our promise is to ensure that constitutional reform takes place. And we have offered to make that promise justiciable. That is to say that any person can take us to court for the failure to fulfill that promise. It's not justiciable now, but we will offer, if we are in power, to make a law that core promises of political parties should be kept, and if not kept, would be a breach of contract with our supporters, so that they can take us to court for failing to comply with that promise.
Thank you, Mr. Ramkarran. To Mr. Panday, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a Senate and you have a House of Representatives. Is this arrangement working in Trinidad, and should our constitution incorporate these two bodies in Guyana?
It is a total waste of time. Why do we need a Senate and a House of Representatives? You know why we got it? because there's a House of Lords in Britain and there's a House of Commons. So they handed us a Westminster type constitution that had to have this kind of division, which is totally irrelevant to Trinidad and Tobago. You see, in our Senate, the opposition is represented and the government is represented, and the president has a few nominees. Now, what is the point of having the government represented in the lower house and the upper house? And what is the point of having the opposition represented in the lower house and the upper house? It's a total waste of time. We need a unicameral government elected on the basis of proportional representation, which hopefully will represent the widest cross-section of the population, and who would have legislative powers only, and legislative powers and powers to monitor a government which is separate from the parliament from day to day. That is the only salvation for us.
That's an excellent point. Are you saying then that Guyana's constitution is far superior to that of Trinidad and Tobago in that context?
Again, there is noise. Would you be kind enough to repeat the question?
Are you hearing me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. Are you saying in that context that Guyana's constitution, with the way we elect our representative to parliament, is superior to that of Trinidad and Tobago?
Not at all. Look, has it led to the development of the people? Has it led to the happiness of the people? No, it has led to conflict of the people, not happiness. Each side suspecting the other, that sort of thing. No, it has not. You see, when you are framing a constitution, you must have reference to the historical antecedents of the people, their hopes, where they came from, what they came for, their hopes, their aspirations, their dreams. And the Constitution must enable them to fulfill those dreams. That is why I am telling you, I am not going by the dictionary definition of a constitution. I am talking about the philosophical and political need of a constitution. And that's a different thing.
Excellent, Mr. Panday. I have an open question here that maybe our members can come in as you wish. With the recent passing of the no confidence vote in our parliament and the ensuing confusion about what is majority vote and dual citizenship, is the current constitution vague in these areas, Mr. Ramkarran?
Well, I don't know that there's a confusion about what a majority is. The government and government spokespersons have raised the issue have created the confusion. The vote was passed by a 33 to 32 majority, a majority which has always been accepted by the National Assembly. It is now being alleged that the majority should have been 34. Well, the court will resolve that very shortly. By the end of the month, the Chief Justice is going to rule. And I'm sure that ruling will say that the no confidence motion was passed with a majority. The issue is that the government is trying to stay in power as long as possible, and they're using these means to extend their life beyond the 3 months which is provided for in the Constitution for elections after no confidence motion. That's the whole issue. It's nothing more than that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Johnson, by the time Mr. Johnson is addressing us in the audience, if you have a question, please let me know so you can ask the question. Mr. Johnson, is our current constitution vague in these areas? Mr. Johnson, are you hearing us? Mr. Panday, is our constitution vague in its current areas with the majority vote and dual citizenship?
Hello.
Apparently, Mr. Johnson is with you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm with you. Sorry, I muted my phone for the interest of clarity. Now, with regard, I think the Constitution is, as Mr. Ramkarran said, the Constitution has been clear on the issue of what constitutes a majority or not. The one area that's come up is the question of citizenship. and how it is that you define the expression of loyalty to a foreign power or another power. I think there's opportunity for further clarification there. But in the larger picture, I would tend to go with the argument Mr. Panday is making with regard to getting back to the fundamental purpose, the larger purpose of what a constitution is supposed to do. The people who have written on the issue of how the nexus between our
election from Mr. Hoyt, he promised to reform the Guyana Constitution, including the executive power that the president has. None of this has been changed during the Panday administration. It doesn't change in the Chedi administration. It doesn't change in the Janet Jagan administration and come down to Barra Jagli. They all criticize you, which I am listening here, all the power and the privileges of the constitutional, which was bourgeoisie, as they call it in Russian term, bullyism. Now, you were there, Mr. Panday. My question to you, why you didn't change the constitution when you were sitting on the Prime Minister's seat in Trinidad and Tobago? And after you, I would like to get an answer from Mr. Ramkarran. He played a major role in the PPP party. Mr. Panday.
Yeah, sure. Let me speak of Trinidad first, because Trinidad and Tobago, because I know that better than Guyana. And the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago can only be changed under the present Constitution. So that in order to change the Constitution, there must be a parliamentary majority of 3/4 of the members of the parliament. When I was there, I didn't have such a majority. In fact, only 3 persons had that kind of majority, which was necessary to have constitutional reform. And that was Dr. Eric Williams, when he was Prime Minister, Mr. A.N.R. Robinson, when he was there, and Kamala Prasad Bissessa during her term. Those were the only parties or groups in the parliament that had the requisite number which is required to change the constitution. And that is changing the constitution peacefully. The problem is that neither party, neither the government nor the opposition in Trinidad wants to change the constitution because the racial division and the racial voting suits them. Now, history is replete with examples where the people are desperate for reform and cannot get it peacefully. The society degenerates to a violent revolution. And I fear that in Trinidad and Tobago, because should that happen, it may very well happen like what took place in Ghana. That is, a political struggle ends up into a racial conflict.
Mr. Ramkarran?
Well, you know, in 1999, we had a process of constitutional reform because people were very dissatisfied with several aspects of the Guyana Constitution. There was a reform process in 1999, but many people, I was the chairman of that process. It involves all the political parties and civil society. And a lot of people were looking forward to the kind of constitutional change that we are now talking about. That is to say, a constitutional reform that would allow things like Mr. Panday is suggesting, quite rightly. That is to say, a parliament that is independent and not controlled by the executive, and other checks and balances in our constitution between the government, the legislature, and the judiciary. We also were hoping that we would institute a system of shared executive governance between the 2 major political parties. Unfortunately, the 2 major political parties were not interested in such reforms. The People's Progressive Party, which had campaigned for a change in the system, reneged on that promise, and the PNC then was never interested in shared governance. So as a result of that, that reform didn't take place, but there were other substantial changes to the Constitution, which made some reforms that were looked forward to, and which are being applied at this present time. But the fundamental issues were not dealt with, and that is because the political parties were not interested in dealing with them.
Correct.
Thank you very much. Listen to Mr. Panday and to Mr. Ramkarran. I'm getting the impression, you're getting the impression here that it might be better for Guyana to have a parliament that is elected separately from that of the government. Is that what I'm hearing, Mr. Panday?
That is exactly what I'm saying has got to happen, whether it's Guyana or whether it's Trinidad. The executive has got to be separate from the parliament. You see, when the executive, that is the government, controls the parliament, they decide how much money they're getting. They decide how to spend it. They decide what to do with it. And so there's enormous corruption, waste, and mismanagement. But when it is separate, the government controls the executive. The parliament controls the executive. So that the executive has to come to the parliament for money. It has to tell that parliament, over which it has no control, incidentally, to tell that parliament what it's going to do with the money, how it is going to spend it. And the parliament, being independent of the legislature, being independent of the executive, is able now to question them. Something like what you have in the American investigating committee system. You can call upon them, ask him questions about how money is being, and in that way you will eliminate a lot of the waste, corruption, and mismanagement.
Thank you, Mr. Panday. Mr. Ramkarran?
Well, I support Mr. Panday. We have similar societies and similar problems, though there are significant differences. Our ethnic loyalties are perhaps more intense than in Trinidad, and we have gone some distance in discussing those loyalties and offering constitutional reform proposals. But I support what Mr. Panday says and agree with his conclusions. Unless the legislature is separate from the executive, you're going to have the separation of powers is going to be just a theory and nothing in practice. And with the collusion of the two, well, not collusion, but the control by the government, by the executive of the legislature, the government gets everything that it wants, and it facilitates, as Mr. Panday suggests, things like corruption and so on.
Yeah. Johnson, your thought?
Hello? Yeah, if I may, Mr. Ramkarran used the word just now, collusion. I think historically there's been a sort of, quite frankly, a de facto collusion to perpetuate the same sort of hegemony that has existed from the inception. There hasn't been any sort of serious committed movement to change the system at any fundamental level. There's been a sort of an accommodation of some aspects of what would be transformative ideas, but by the time it gets into the parliamentary system, which is again controlled by the executive, but also controlled by the opposition, there seems to be a sort of a tacit agreement that it can only go so far. The parliamentary standing committee on constitutional reform has received a report as of, I think, December 2015, which is it's a sort of bulleted point report, but it's substantial in its recommendations, including the suggestion of an 18-month timeline and funding from the IADD and stuff. And but the government hasn't pushed it forward, and the opposition hasn't protested that it has not been pushed forward. So there is a sort of de facto collusion, or at least tacit agreement. Not saying, but when elections come around, there's always been this lip service that constitutional reform is necessary. Usually more pushed by the side in opposition than the side in government. And this has been the cycle, the perpetual cycle.
Dr. Ramay?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Mr. Ramkarran, very much known to me. My first question to you, that in 1992 after the election, my interpretation of what the 23 years of the PVP, they were enjoying the Burnham Constitution and continue with the same rhetoric that we had for the 28 years. I have seen today with the no confidence motion that in 2011, after the AFC got 7 seats in the parliament, and 2015, they voted a no confidence motion. Nobody took a stand to say, well, 34 makes up the majority. But today, everybody stood quiet. The same constitution, the same voting pattern, where 33-32 voted for the PPP out. And today, there's so much rhetoric is going on that the PPP, they have to take the matter to the court, and the court has to decide. What is the function, Mr. Panday, with the 33-32 for this no confidence motion for a new election in Guyana?
Sorry, was that question directed to me?
Yeah, to the panel, but Mr. Panday, you can go ahead and answer the question, Mr.
What was the question? Sorry, I'm so sorry.
You was talking about the no confidence vote with 33-32 being 65.
Oh, yes, yeah. Yes, well, I suppose it is foolish to think that a majority consists of 23 and a half men instead of 24, 23, and so on. I think there's a lot of crap, and it really is an attempt to postpone an election in accordance with their constitution. But that is my point. My point is we are messing around with something that shouldn't be there in the first place, namely our constitutions.
Mr. Ramkarran?
Well, I mean, I've already answered the question about 34 and 32. I don't think the point has no merit, absolutely no merit whatsoever. And it's only a ploy to delay the elections which are due to be held in March. So that's all there is to it. I mean, there is no big legal issue on it. I think the court will rule appropriately in a couple of weeks.
Mr. Johnson,
just for clarification, I can't recall any of the current court cases being filed on the numerical calculation. If I may be corrected, I think
the case by Ruel, the case that was brought by the Attorney General. There are 3 cases. One brought by a man named Reed. One brought by a man named Reed, who challenges the legality of Charandas's status as a member of Parliament because of the dual citizenship. The Attorney General has brought a case which relates to the majority. He's saying that the majority should be 34 and not 33. And Christopher Ram has brought a case which calls for a declaration that the government should resign, that the cabinet president should resign. Those are the 3 cases which are pending.
Okay, well, in that case, I have seen the precedent that has been cited in other jurisdictions. In my opinion, while in those jurisdictions they apply, both because of the wording and because of our own precedent here, I don't think it's whatever the reasons for it being filed, I don't think the numerical issue is one that offers any sort of way out with regard to the perpetuation of the current government. I think it should be, it has been passed. One question has been raised with regard to the citizenship issue. I think has to do with Article 165(2), which speaks to the issue of whether or not if Sharon Das Prasad has been deemed ineligible to have voted in Parliament virtue of his dual citizenship, whether the decision stands or not.
That question about dual citizenship. When I was a member of Parliament, I hold dual citizenship. Nothing came out. Moses and Kevin.
Oh yeah.
Since 2011, I was.
Of course, because yeah.
Question is why?
I think I think the law has been.
Why
not
the
been,
question came with
this,
this
again, when
particular
the
government?
issue.
No. The question is, I want to ask, and I think you owe us an explanation. Why with this government, everything in the Constitution is wrong? But 2011, we had citizenship from both parties in Parliament. I'm a citizen of the United States, and I was in Parliament for 3 years. And the other question is, in 2015, when 33-32 threw the PBP out of government for a new election, that was okay. Now everything is in disarray. Is that fair in the legal system that we are perpetrating at this time of our time?
I've spoken to the issue before of what is the kind of the de facto agreement, tacit agreement, or collusion between the hegemonic parties. Although there's an apparent adversarial and a very real, not just apparent, but a very real adversarial relationship between them. Like all historical adversaries, there's also a very real element of mutual perpetuation. So the areas of agreed action, and one of those areas of agreed action has been to observe the parliamentary prohibition of allowing people with dual citizenship or other questionable nationalities in Parliament. Now, hopefully, this judgment settles the issue once and for all. I don't believe, I'm thinking Mr. Ramkarran has offered it to you, I think we have to have a more nuanced view of participation. Certainly, I think citizenship, single citizenship, should be the top tier for as a barrier to entry of participation in the legislature. But when we consider the wealth of skills that exist outside of Ghana, I think there has to be sort of a hierarchical system for participation that has incentives, but also restrictions on what it takes to participate as a dual citizenship. I don't believe it should be exclusion. So one area that I think the Constitution has to be reformed or amended has to do with how it is that we engage the diaspora within the legislature, or whichever position they'd like to serve.
Mr. Johnson,
and still look for the integrity of the privilege of citizenship. Certainly, I would say this up front. I think the head of state and the head of government should be citizens and should not enjoy dual citizenship, because we had the example with I think Fujimori from Peru a couple of years back, about 2 decades ago, who enjoyed dual citizenship, who was charged with both human rights abuses and massive corruption, but who used his citizenship for Japan to escape justice in the country in which he was head of state. So we can't have that with the apex of government or state responsibility. But certainly, considering the amount of skills that we exist, not just we tend to think of dual citizenship with this dichotomy of Guyana and the developed world. But they're Guyanese citizens, or people who have dual citizenship, or Guyanese with citizenship in Trinidad, for example, whose skills can be brought back into bear here. So,
thank you, Mr.
That would be my solution to it.
Thank you, sir. You preempt my question, but before I ask that question, I want to refer to Article 64 of our Constitution. It says, all questions as to membership of the National Assembly shall be determined by the High Court in accordance with the provision of Article 163 of our Constitution. So I think the Speaker's ruling that the court decided, I think, is constitutional.
Will be proper place, yeah.
Section 165 also says that the Assembly, subject to provision of the Constitution, that Assembly may regulate its own procedure and may make rules for that purpose. The Assembly and the presence or participation in the proceedings of the Assembly shall not invalidate those proceedings. So all proceedings of Parliament,
Yes, which tends.
interpretation of dual citizenship is true or not, that cannot invalidate the proceeding of Parliament. My question to the honored guest is, there is much talk about the diaspora. With a much larger, wealthier, more educated and more skilled diaspora, should our Constitution guarantee an official role for the diaspora at the political, governance and economic levels? Maybe we can start with Mr. Ramkarran.
Well, I guess I've answered, so the others could answer.
Okay.
So I give my take on that.
Excuse me, 1 second. Mr. Johnson, can you just mute your mic for when you're talking? So
Ramkarran?
when you're not talking.
Mr. Ramkarran, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Did you hear my question?
Your question is in relation to Article 165(2).
Well, not quite. My question.
I believe that
Yes. Sorry, go on.
I believe that is the article that provides that a member, the vote of a member shall be valid, even if that member's qualifications for sitting in the National Assembly are not lawful.
Well, let me read. Can I read it to you?
That-
It says 165(2) says, the Assembly may act